I think we are ready to make a start. Good morning, good afternoon, depending where you're joining in from. My name is Giacomo Persipaoli. I am the head of UNIDIR's Security and Technology Program, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to this multi-stakeholder dialogue on subsea communication cables and responsible state behavior. This is a fully hybrid event that combines participation here in the room with colleagues online. So please, by all means, whether you're here in the room or you're following us online, do engage with our experts. I will spend a few more words to explain you the mechanics of this event later on. But first and foremost, I wanted just to spend a few words to introduce the subject. So this is an event, a multi-stakeholder dialogue that is meant to do two things. One is an occasion to comment and share with you our latest report that was authored by the colleague sitting on my right, Dr. Camino Kavanagh, exactly on the topic of subsea cables and responsible state behavior. But it's also an opportunity to hear different perspectives from the multi-stakeholder community. We will have representatives today of governmental organizations, of non-governmental organizations, industry, practitioners, cables manufacturer, to really try to understand what are the threats and vulnerabilities of this very peculiar critical infrastructure that underpins pretty much the internet as we know it today. Now, depending on who you ask, the percentage of data that travels on subsea cables changes between 95, 98, 99. It's a lot. It's the vast majority. It doesn't matter if it's 95 or 90 or 99. The message here is that alternative means of ensuring connectivity, like satellite, are still not deployed at scale enough to really represent a viable alternative, globally. So subsea cables remains today the critical information infrastructure. But it's also affected by a very particular, I would say, cognitive bias, which is, I spent 15 years in the Navy, and we had this expression that goes sea blindness. So whatever is at sea and people don't notice, they don't know it's there, and tends to go under discussed and under noticed. One of the key distinctive features of this critical information infrastructure is that if you exclude the landing site, so that the dry part of the infrastructure, again, well over 90% of it runs under the ocean, where it's out of sight for most people, out of sight for most sectors that rely on it very heavily, and as such tends to be forgotten. When we've been following the discussions in the UN multilateral kind of fora. And when you hear states engage on critical infrastructure, they talk about the energy grid, they talk about gas and oil, they talk about the healthcare as a sector, financial sector. All of these are very well present in the discussion, but very rarely we hear the issue of subsea cables being discussed. Although we might be witnessing a potential shift. Recent events that involved other type of critical infrastructure that is running subsea may potentially have brought to light that there is, in fact, a very wide portion of this infrastructure that runs on the seabed, and that's important to keep in mind, with communication cables being one of them. We've also seen amazing technological progression and advancements in undersea uncrewed systems and autonomous systems that are slowly unlocking new possibilities and new ways for state actors, non-state actors to engage in subsea activities. So I think overall there is a growing interest and momentum, and we thought that this would be a good opportunity for UNIDIR to release a paper on the subject and convene an event like today. Of course, like all of you know, UNIDIR is a voluntary funded organization, so everything that we do is only possible thanks to the generous contribution of our sponsors, and this particular report and this event is part of a new work stream that the Security and Technology Program has launched this year, thanks to the support of the European Union, a work stream that focuses on key enabling technologies and key enabling infrastructure. What is it? How does it work? What are the threats? And what are some of the potential governance responses that are needed? So what a better way to start than to focus on subsea cables. I would like now to give the floor to kick us off from a substantive perspective to Ms. Manon Leblanc, who is the head of the cyber policy sector at the European External Action Service, and very happy that she is able to join us, at least virtually, to share with us some opening remarks, and then we will proceed with a short briefing by Camino on the report itself. Just a logistical note for those of you that it's the first time attending a meeting here in the Palais, there are no speakers in the room. So if you want to, like loudspeakers in the room, so if you want to hear what is being said online, please make sure that you wear your earpiece. And otherwise it's going to be a very long mute meeting for a while. So that being said, Manon, I hope you can hear me well, and over to you. You have the floor.
Definitely, I can hear you very well, and I hope the same indeed counts for yourself and for all the colleagues in the room. I hope everyone, meanwhile, has been able to put on their headphones and connect to today's meeting. First of all, thank you very much, UNIDIR, for having invited the EU to open this event and having me personally in this event as indeed head of cyber policy at the European External Action Service. The event we see indeed is part of this larger project by UNIDIR on emerging technologies and security issues that the EU is funding, namely the project called Unlocking Innovation, Enabling Technologies and International Security. And the message that we would like to send by funding such projects on emerging technologies and security is a message actually of importance and of urgency. We should put emerging technologies and security on top of the international agenda, because we will for surely profit from emerging technologies, but we're also faced with challenges that we can only solve by having international cooperation. As all know, the EU and member states strongly promote a global, open, free, stable and secure cyberspace where international law, the respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms fully apply, and where supporting social, political and economic development are supported. In this context, we could recall the important work achieved by the international community to advance international security and stability in cyberspace, and as well as to address cyber threats. And I see many participants online today, which are also part of those discussions. However, what we also see is that the cyber threat landscape is continuously evolving, and cyberspace is increasingly being misused to conduct malicious cyber activities, including cyber attacks as a mean of hybrid warfare, which we strongly condemn. We should ensure that states use ICTs in a responsible manner, taking into account the essential role of technologies for our society. And notably, and you mentioned already yourself, the essential role of subsea communication cables through their facilitation of data transmission make them crucial for the functioning of our society and to the development of historically remote regions, to international security and to scientific research. And the greatest threats to the proper functioning of these cables include cyber attacks, intentional cable sabotage, disruption by phishing and anchoring, and they are mostly of cross-border nature. And the international nature of benefits of subsea communication cables and threats to their functioning necessitates international measures to manage and protect this vital piece of infrastructure. As established by UNIDIR's recent report, and I thank Camino personally for the report on subsea cables, which is called Wading Murky Waters, the extant cable governance regime is a patchwork of treaties, frameworks, organizations, practices and standards that leaves much to be desired when it comes to legal cover, adherence and resilience. So it is of vital importance that the regime is strengthened and amended to ensure proper protection of subsea cables in an international framework. A major step in this direction would be strengthening of the United Nations Convention of the Law of the Sea, and we call upon states that have not yet done to sign and ratify this convention, which currently serves as a main point of reference for subsea cable management. Implementation of the convention is currently insufficient, and we also call up all partners to the convention to abide by its requirements, to adopt laws making infliction of damage to subsea cables a punishable offense. Furthermore, we are encouraged by the recent increase in government participation in the International Cable Protection Committee, or the ICPC. This crucial body, representing 89% of the world's subsea communication cables, allows for exchange between all stakeholders within subsea cable infrastructure and can thus offer fruitful exchanges between the public and the private sector. Despite its recent positive trend, government participation in the IPCC remains low, and for this reason we encourage all states to take part in the 2023 ICPC plenary, which will be held in Madrid from 18 to 20 April this year. Previous UNIDIR work has established a strong foundation upon which measures ensuring the protection of subsea cables can be built. First committee negotiations, of which I'm part myself, on responsible state behavior in cyberspace also include the protection of critical infrastructure, and we stress the need to adhere to the norms and continue our discussions about their application, including as regards transnational critical infrastructure, paying special attention on how they may relate to subsea cables and specific issues such as violations of the norms within international waters. And we hope that they may eventually contribute to strengthening the overall international cable governance regime. The United Nations is well placed as the dialogue platform on the use of information and communication technologies by states in the context of international peace and security. And to ensure such dialogue, but moreover the implementation of responsible state behavior in cyberspace, the EU and member states, together with their partners, continue to work on the establishment of the Programme of Action to advance responsible state behavior in cyberspace, as voted upon last year by 160 states. In this context, we encourage all states to contribute by mid-April to the report by the UN Secretary General on the work towards a future establishment of the POA. And we also encourage the exchange of best practices in the area of subsea cable governance in the context of those discussions. We would like to highlight that the ICPC document entitled Government Best Practices for Protecting and Promoting Resilience of Submarine Telecommunication Cables, the newest version of which was released last November in 2022 and published on the ICPC website. The document lists best practices on industry and government work, existing legal frameworks, and the ICPC's extensive research in the area. We recommend all states to take these recommendations to heart in their governance of subsea cable infrastructure. At the same time, we also hope that states will feel inspired by the examples set out in the EU Network and Information Security Directive. Under this directive, member states are to implement national cybersecurity strategies that take into account cybersecurity of undersea communication cables and include a mapping of potential cybersecurity risks and mitigation measures to secure the highest level of their protection. Furthermore, it sets out requirements on the establishment of national computer security incident response teams, CERTs called, which are tasked with incident handling according to a well-defined process and can rapidly and effectively respond to any incident involving subsea communication cables. The directive further establishes a union-wide network of national CERTs, allowing for exchanges to improve the functioning and interoperability, as well as cooperation to respond to incidents efficiently and in a coordinated manner. The revised Network and Information Security, the NRS2, which came out recently, will even further improve the network and information security by reinforcing cybersecurity rules, improving oversight, and tightening implementation requirements. We encourage all states to take similar measures and to enhance the international framework for further protection of subsea communication cables, as well as, with such measures, adhere to the norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. In this light, and taking into consideration the strategic environment that cyberspace is and the increase of malicious cyber activities we have seen over recent years, the EU recognizes the importance of discussions such as today, as well as the role of the United Nations in further advancing responsible state behavior in cyberspace. In this context, I wish you all a fruitful discussion today, and thank you again for having me.
Thank you, Manon, for your opening remarks and for your support again to this wider project of which this initiative is part. You highlighted the threats. You also highlighted some of the already existing governance or policy efforts that are present to try to mitigate such risks and ensure responsible behavior in states. So it was the perfect kind of scene-setting opening remarks for our event today. So thank you again, and I hope you'll be able to follow the discussion for a bit, because I know you have to disconnect soon, but thank you so much for joining us. The next, as I said, we're now going to be giving the chance to Camino to share with you some of the highlights or provide you with a quick overview of the report that was launched I think Thursday last week, so you should have had a couple of days but to review it. But Camino is going to provide you with an overview of some of the key findings of the report before we move into the panel discussion. So if you're following us online and you have any questions or comments, please feel free to use the Q&A tab on the WebEx platform. I will be monitoring that from my screen, and I will be very happy to then report the questions to our speakers. If you're in the room and you would like to take the floor, please just flag it to me using your physical hand instead of your virtual one, and I'll make sure to give you the floor as soon as possible. With that, Camino, whenever you're ready, the floor is yours. We can see it.
So thank you so much, Giacomo, and thank you to UNIDIR and also to Manon for accepting to present and publish and present this report today. It's been an interesting journey. I've had fantastic conversations over the past 6 months with a range of colleagues across industry associations, government and academia. And there is a very, very rich community out there that I'm hoping many of you will encounter in the coming period. So how do I move this? So basically what I'm going to cover this morning, I'm going to go through a quick introduction to the report. We're going to talk about what's in a subsea cable system. I'm not going to go too deep into that because I know colleagues online are going to cover that issue. So we have a number of dependencies, technologies, the actors, and questions of risk management and resilience that I know that others are going to talk about. I'm going to go a little bit deeper into threats and vulnerabilities, what keeps governments up at night, what keeps industry up at night, and what keeps some of us in academia up at night. I'll talk about the implications of these and what the response frameworks are at present, and I'll end with some concluding remarks. So an introduction to the report. So the focus of the report, as Manon and Giacomo alluded to, is very much focused on state behavior in subsea cables. So subsea cables, they are a critical element of the broader ICT ecosystem. 95% of intercontinental data is transmitted across those cables. This is something that was confirmed in Bangkok at Suboptic annual conference just a couple of weeks ago. By telegeography. There's more than 500 subsea cables in operation or planned at present. Subsea cables are critical to the provision of essential public services, financial services, humanitarian action, and so forth. There are growing concerns among states about the vulnerability of cables to potential interference or sabotage by other states. I think we've seen all the news over the past 9 months in particular. These and many other related concerns are emerging at a critical juncture in international politics and at a moment of increasing dependency on the infrastructure. Are these concerns legitimate? Do they chime with those of industry and the rest of us? What observable trends can be discerned from how states are responding to real and perceived threats? Is there scope for a more global and inclusive conversation on the nature and scope of the threat and on their implications? And if so, what would the starting point be and where would that conversation take place? Manon has already alluded to some of those answers, so I'm going to present a little bit more deeply in those. I'm not going to go into what's in a subsea cable. I know Simon online is going to talk a little bit about that, and some cable system architectures. I will make a note on some of the actors involved. It's a very complex industry. In subsea, some subsea cable systems, the traditional ones, there could be many industry actors involved. I think Kent, if I'm not mistaken, I think the largest consortium might have up to 90 members, although that's changing now, I think. And we can come back to that afterwards. There are new actors engaging, including from Asia, but also some of the hyperscalers are engaging more and more for different reasons. And I think that merits a conversation as well. On the actual the map, I think you may all be familiar with the telegeography map. This is the 2022 map, highlighting where all the different cable systems connect to. Evidently, this is not precise data, but gives you an idea of where the cable, where our growing dependency is coming to. So threats and vulnerabilities, well, I found it useful to stop and think a little bit about what keeps industry folks up at night. And this varies significantly across regions, but evidently they're concerned about cable system and network resilience, and ensuring protection from damage caused mainly by commercial activity, that could be fishing, anchoring, but also by natural phenomena. They're concerned about the direction of government policy and regulation, maybe too little, too much. There's a strong focus on permitting and licensing decisions at present, and delays in relevant decision-making processes. This does give rise to much concern on the part of many industry actors. There are a number of protection issues coming to the fore: landing, burial of cables, related to questions relating to marine spatial planning, and then new issues coming to the fore with regard to marine protected areas, and that very much relates to the new BBNJ treaty that I'm sure we're going to hear about later on today. Evidently, there are concerns about maintenance and repair capabilities, the number of available ships, aging fleets. This is a concern across regions. The shifting character of the cable industry, traditional builds versus hyperscalers. Evidently, this is something that I won't talk about, but I'm hoping some of our colleagues will. Then there are workforce issues. I've heard many in industry talk about aging issues within the workforce, and how to keep introducing younger colleagues across the ecosystem, from an academic perspective all the way across to repair and maintenance. Then there's a diversity within the sector. It's still traditionally and overly male, but the strong efforts are being made within the industry to ensure that this changes over time. Even just in some of the industry conferences, significant effort is being made to deal with this. Concerns about taxation, cost of and access to capital. Then there are all of the environmental, climate and sustainability issues that are coming to the fore, and which were a big focus of one of the recent industry conferences. Evidently, industry folks are also concerned about the direction of international politics, and as well media coverage of cable incidents. It's not always the best, and I strongly encourage many folks in covering these issues to contact relevant industry actors and associations to confirm some of your doubts, and some of the points that you raise in your articles. And then there's I think concern about the lack of public awareness of subsea cable systems and resilience efforts that are underway. And I think that's also a job for I think many in the industry to also ensure that there's more public engagement in that regard. But this is actually quite different to what keeps governments up at night. Again, these concerns vary significantly across regions. States are evidently concerned about an ever more complex digital ecosystem. I think we're seeing that regardless of which angle we're looking at the ICT ecosystem from. There's growing complexity. We've layered and tiered dependencies that are operating at a global scale, and they could trigger failures that are not currently considered in existing risk management and mitigation frameworks. And that goes as much to subsea cable systems as well as others. States are concerned about cable system and network resilience as well. They're also concerned about state-backed espionage and surveillance activity at sea and on land. They're concerned about cable sabotage or other types of gray zone activity that could be used for signaling purposes or stronger. And they're concerned about subsea cable protection, including the scope and scale of maritime surveillance needs to cover the blindness that Giacomo referred to. They're also concerned about broader supply chain security and availability issues. There are limited access to data on cable faults and disruptions. Whether this is a legitimate concern or not is something I think worth talking about. They're concerned about the extant cable governance regime, as Manon referred to earlier. Is it too weak? Is it too strong? Is it somewhere in the middle? There are questions of responsibility and accountability that need to be taken into consideration. And then beyond that, there are environmental, climate, and sustainability issues that states have committed to dealing with. And then evidently this meeting SDG 9, ensuring that all countries are connected, and especially those that are traditionally isolated from the rest of the world. And what keeps academia up at night? And this is an interesting conversation that I've been having with colleagues in different regions of the world. Evidently, our concerns are quite different. We're definitely concerned about the current trajectory of international politics and strategic instability, and their very varying vectors of escalation. There's narrowing space for diplomacy and dialogue at the official level, track 1.5 and track 2. We have an ever more complex digital ecosystem. There's the issue of state-backed activity that I just mentioned. And there are also a number of other protracted and highly international civil armed conflicts in which critical information infrastructure, including terrestrial and subsea cable infrastructure, can be targeted and is being targeted through physical or cyber means. And that infrastructure can also be captured by conflict parties. There are industry and government concerns about industry and government capacity to actually protect subsea cable infrastructure and the data transmitted through the cables. There are concerns about an over-securitization of the response, or maybe it may be under-securitized. And then again, the extant cable governance regime, is it too strong or too weak? And I think here many academic colleagues would err on the side of it being too weak, as Manon had mentioned. There's the question of oversight and accountability again of government behaviour vis-a-vis cables, the roles and responsibilities of government actors, and again, a lack of general public awareness of the place of subsea cables in the broader ICT ecosystem. Implications. Now, I think history is always a really good mirror to reflect on current state behaviours. As you're all very aware, I'm sure, the military value of subsea cables and laying and repair preparedness was recognised as something critical to states as early as the 1850s, and it was gradually integrated. Cable tapping and sabotage was gradually integrated into into war planning from that period on. And I think we're all aware aware that the cutting of Germany's cables was one of the first salvos of World War I. It was also one of those of World War II. During that period, there was also fierce competition over critical supply chain materials. During that period, it was gutta percha. During the current period, it's a range of other components. There was fierce competition to shape the normative environment, and I think if many of you have done any research relevant to the 1884 Telegraph Convention and the 1907 Hague Regulations, you'll understand why certain articles are the way they are and why there was a pushback to not restrict belligerent activity during that period. And I would call your attention here to Article 15 of the 1884 Telegraph Convention in this regard. So today we are at another inflection point in international politics, and we have a much more complex international system. We're much more dependent on subsea cables and information technologies writ large. There are many, many more actors involved, some of who dispute the legitimating principles underpinning the current international order, and some that remain very tethered to it. So how should states respond today to the activity that they are concerned about? Should they take a militaristic approach, highly securitized? What about a normative approach focused on expanding the scope of UNCLOS, or in something completely new? I think this has come up in many contexts, and I referenced some of those proposals in the report. There are many legitimate arguments for doing so, yet is there an enabling environment for going in that direction? How about a regulatory approach very much focused on decoupling from non-trustworthy actors and technologies, or a hands-off approach? Let's leave it to industry. Industry will protect the cables, and we rely very much on their capacity to do so. But each of these, I think, fall short in and of themselves, and I explain that in the report. There are some observable trends at the moment, and we see a hardening of domestic policy and law relevant to foreign investment in subsea cables systems. There are lengthier time spans for permitting and licensing decisions. I call this reactive routing. There's a decade of it. It's come to a crunch in the past few years. There's been a hardening of domestic law and policy relevant to supply chain components, a hardening of physical and cybersecurity of subsea cable systems. There's growing dependence or defense expenditure in maritime monitoring and surveillance capabilities, and more targeted digital infrastructure investments in developing countries and regions. And these are not often because of the desire and the will to ensure greater connectivity. They're sometimes perceived as offsetting strategies in terms of other countries and competing for investments in certain regions. There are new coordination mechanisms that have been set up. I've mentioned some of those in the European and the NATO context. We can go into detail afterwards. I think what I've tried to question in the report is whether a global and more cooperative approach, if there's room for that, so that the concerns of other states and industry actors and actors like many of you in the room can engage on the issues. And maybe a potential starting point for this could be a more informed global discussion involving relevant actors on the nature and scope of related threats and vulnerabilities. There are many misunderstandings and misreporting on these. A global discussion on the status and implementation or adherence to existing standards, best practices, normative commitments, and emerging regulatory requirements. And here I do mention in quite detail. I'm not going to go into them now because we'll be discussing these in the next sessions, but the ICPC government best practices, both those existing ones and some forthcoming ones. I talk about the normative commitments made by states at the UN that Manon mentioned, and that many of you here and online are very aware of. I also mentioned the new reporting requirements emerging under the framework of the updated NIS directive. But there's also room for more CBMs, more work on CBMs and discrete crisis management mechanisms, including for situations of tension and conflict. I think there's also room for a greater interaction between public and private actors and ensuring secure and trusted platforms for sharing information, especially for those incidents that do have a bearing on national and international security and stability. And beyond security, definitely there is much more room for considering how existing and commonly adhered to principles such as transparency, sustainability, and accountability can guide work on digital infrastructure and ensuring connectivity across regions. And finally, before I stop here, I think there's also a lot of room for learning and innovation, and identifying and investing in this regard in heritage centres and specialised foundations across the globe for more forward-leaning initiatives involving youth from across countries and regions. That some of those steps are already underway, but they really need to be strengthened. I won't go into all of these. I would like just to focus on the public-private partnership aspects, which I think is fundamental, and there should be more exchanges between states and industry on the incentive and accountability structures that can help overcome current trust deficits and other barriers to data sharing, and identify potential models for two-way secure and trusted information sharing that builds on best practices in other sensitive environments. Now, there are a number of other areas that have managed to establish those platforms, and it could be useful to possibly look at those. I think there would also be room for looking at trends and faults and disruptions without sharing proprietary commercial information as a means to identify those potential high risk and low vulnerability incidents with a bearing on national security. I'm going to stop there. There's lots more to talk about, and thank you very much, Giacomo, for giving me the opportunity to talk today.
Thank you, Camino, for the comprehensive overview of the report. And by all means, the report is available online on our website. If you have questions or comments or input on the subject, do not hesitate to reach out to us or to Camino directly. We're always happy to hear your thoughts, your comments, and your inputs on this subject. So we're now pivoting to the more kind of interactive part of the discussion. We're going to be running two sessions, one that focuses on vulnerabilities and threats, and the other one that focuses on governance and policy responses. We have asked all of the speakers that I'm going to introduce in a second to spontaneously, if you want, react to a series of guiding questions that we're going to be projecting on the screen behind me. And there are no more formal presentations. This is structured as a discussion among experts. And please also let me reiterate the invitation to all of you in the physical or digital audience to join the discussion if you wish to do so. Actually, I think I made I wouldn't say a lie, but it's probably being incorrect, because we still have one last structured presentation, if you want, which is from one of our speakers. I don't know how many of you are familiar with subsea cables. I don't know how many of you have actually seen what a subsea cable look like, how it is constructed, built, or installed. So I think for the benefit of the 124 participants to this meeting, me included, it would be good to start this part of the conference of the event by giving the opportunity to one of our discussants to share his thoughts and his some visual that can at least help everyone be on the same page, and you all know what we're talking about when we're talking about subsea cables. So before I give the floor to Simon, let me just introduce quickly the very rich set of discussants that we have prepared for you today. I'll start it for the colleagues here on the stage with me, starting on my left with Mr. Kent Bressy, who is International Law Advisor at the International Cable Protection Committee. Well, you know Camino by now. Camino Kavanagh, that is not only one of our most trusted collaborator and author of the report, but she is also a senior visiting fellow at the Department of War Studies at King's College London. And then at the far right, we have Mr. Pavel Mraz, who is Senior Project Manager with Digital Diplomacy Team at Microsoft. We're then joined online by other speakers that I hope you can see behind me. If one thing, you can please put the grid behind me again. Ms. Sandra Delaney, who is General Counsel at Aquacoms. Dr. Tobias Liebetrau, who is a researcher at the Center for Military Studies at the University of Copenhagen. Dr. Tuwela Nyorenda Jere, who is the head of the Economic Integration Division at the African Union Development Agency. Dr. Amrish Fukar, who is at the Internet Measurement and Data Expert at the Internet Society at the Mauritius. Ms. Noël van der Wijk-Koling, who is the Cyber Program Lead at the Security Institute for Governance and Leadership in Africa. And then, last but not least, and also our first speaker to give you the presentation is Mr. Simon Webster, who is the Director for Submarine Networks at NEC Corporation. So as you can see, a very diverse range of speakers, and I'm really excited to hear their views and perspectives on this very interesting topic. But before we take a stab at the guiding questions, please, Simon, if you can hear me and if you're ready to take the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, and thank you, Camino, for your excellent introduction. Let me hopefully share my screen. I hope you can see that now. You can see that now.
Yes, we can.
Thank you. Assuming you can. Camino already showed a version of this map showing that where well, telecom cables are deployed pretty much everywhere. I think the point I'd like to make here is that in the last few years, the capacity of submarine cables has increased dramatically to keep up with demand. One of the Trans-Pacific cables completed only in 2017 contains 4 fibers, 2 fiber pairs. So that's only, what, 7 years old. By contrast, the latest transatlantic cable, currently under construction, has 48 fibers, 24 fiber pairs, and that can carry 500 terabits of capacity per second. So the demand for capacity is increasing at a great pace, and frankly, see no end to that demand anytime soon. So what is a telecom cable? Those who are not familiar with submarine telecom cables are often surprised by how small they are. When laid in deep water, they are typically around the size of your index finger, or another common phrase is the size of a garden hose. So in waters deeper than 1,000 meters, they are pretty safe from human interference, and they're quite deep, mostly only susceptible to damage from natural effects such as earthquakes and landslides. In shallow water, they are more vulnerable to damage, particularly from fishing vessels, particularly trawlers, and from ships' anchors. And one way to protect the cable is to add steel wires around the outside. So the process is shown here in the cable factory. The armoring, the addition of armor wires to the inner core, the 17mm core. So even with a double layer of armoring, then the cable is still only around 40 to 45 millimeters in diameter. So a lot smaller than most people think, frankly speaking. There are other ways to protect the cables, particularly in shallow waters. One is to use a cable plow towed behind a cable ship or a specialized cable installation vessel on the left-hand side here. This buries the cable at a target burial depth of around 1 to 3 meters below the subsoil, depending on the soil conditions. We can't bury the cable directly into a rocky seabed, so other techniques such as applying external pipe here, or we can use cut into the rock with a large saw. The scale of the operation here may be not very clear. The plow on the left is around about 8 to 9 meters high. The rock saw itself here is, there's a person standing here. You can get the idea of the scale, perhaps, that is around about 5 meters long. So pretty big operations, but these are purely to protect the cable from external aggression. So while we can bury the cable or indeed armor it, it's still necessary to recover the cable in some circumstances. Damage to cable does occur, mostly, as Camilla mentioned, caused by fishing and shipping, and then hence these cables need to be repaired. There are around about, on average, 200 cable faults per year globally, which is pretty low considering the extent of the cable network. You know, there's a huge network of cables out there, as we saw previously. So these are the types of, shown here are types of grapnel used to tools which can be deployed to recover the cable from the seabed. In the bottom image here, you see the white line here is actually a lightweight cable that's been caught by a grapnel. So although the cable hasn't been physically cut in two, it will have been severely damaged and probably rendered inoperable. And so let's not forget the terrestrial infrastructure. The landing point here, shown here, will generally be well publicized in advance by the local authorities, who will have to close part of the beach to the public. So the submarine cable itself terminates in a beach manhole, which is basically a large concrete box accessible via a hatch. This is maybe 2 by 3 by 4 meters kind of dimension here. And cable station, an example is shown here. Most cable stations are pretty anonymous buildings, but actually some are clearly marked as such. So the point here is that a cable system's potential vulnerabilities are not necessarily limited to the submerged portion of its extent. So I'll land there. That's just a quick introduction for those who maybe not so familiar with cables and the associated infrastructure. And back to you, Giacomo. Thank you.
Thank you, Simon. This was very useful to visualize again what it is that we're talking about, and it is interesting to see how small they are, how potentially vulnerable they are. It's also interesting to note that you may be able to efficiently protect thousands and thousands of kilometers of cable at sea, but then if you fail to protect the dry part of the infrastructure, then all of your effort in protecting the part at sea are somewhat useless. So very interesting. I think we are set up to have an interesting discussion now, and if Wenting, you can please share, put up the guiding questions again. What I'm now going to ask is just to give the opportunity to all of our discussants to take the floor. You can raise your virtual hand if you want to intervene, or by all means unmute yourself and start talking. Is a group that is small enough that we can manage. So I'm just really interested in hearing your perspective on. We heard Camino saying, different communities may have different perceptions of threats, different perception of vulnerabilities, have their concerns that are slightly different. So based on the wide range of perspectives that we have on the panel, what are, in your opinion, the main threats and vulnerabilities? What are some of the common approaches to managing and mitigating and building resilience when it comes to subsea cables? There is the issue of data sharing on subsea cable incidents. both physical incidents and cyber incidents between industry, well, within industry, between industry and governments, and potentially even at the state-to-state level. So how can we improve the data sharing kind of architecture and mechanisms? And what about supply chain risks? Now we're hearing supply chains becoming, growing again in attention. And supply chains, I think, given the specificity of the infrastructure, I think we're talking about both like physical supply chain, but also digital supply chain. So it's that sort of hybrid infrastructure that really forces you to keep your guard up in both the physical and the digital domain, because one of the two might not be sufficient. So this is just a starting set of questions that are open for comments from all of our speakers. And I see, Kent, you want to go first, please.
Thank you, Giacomo. And I was also just going to ask, did you want us to take these questions in order? Or I think it'd be easier maybe if we did take them in order. I was just going to start, first of all, by thanking UNIDIR and you, Giacomo, for organizing this today, Camino for her presentation, and I also wanted to applaud Manon LeBlanc's comments and very complimentary comments about the ICPC, which, for those of you who don't know, we're the principal global organization representing submarine cable operators devoted to cable protection. And so my work revolves around the substance that we're talking about today. The ICPC has more than 180 members in more than 60 countries around the world, including government members, although it is an NGO, not an intergovernmental organization, which I'll talk about a little later. On the first question, what keeps us up at night? I'm going to focus on physical threats and vulnerabilities because I think from the ICPC's perspective, cyber vulnerabilities are not unique to submarine cable systems. They are common to all electronic communications networks. And the ICPC keeps statistics on cable damage, what causes events that require repair. And each year, about 70% of those events are attributable to fishing gear and commercial vessel anchors. And almost all other events are either from natural events like volcanoes, as we saw recently in Tonga, tsunamis, underwater landslides, as Simon was mentioning, other uncoordinated marine activity with other marine industries. We have emerging threats there with offshore wind projects, and also with deep seabed mining. I spent a lot of time at the International Seabed Authority in Jamaica working on the emerging draft exploitation regulations that will govern deep seabed mining. And so the risks with fishing and anchors, I think, are known to the industry. What keeps us up at night? Government actions that reduce resilience, that cause, if you look at the maps that were shown by Simon and by Camino, you see that there's a clustering of cables along particular routes and particular landing points. Some of that is driven by commercial or technical considerations, but a lot of it is regulatory. Governments try to push cables into narrow corridors to keep areas open for other marine activities, particularly fishing. That increases the likelihood that one event is going to damage multiple cables. And so that's definitely reduced resilience. Increased permitting times, particularly for repairs. There is great pressure to repair cables as quickly as possible, but if it takes months to obtain a repair permit, that is a big problem. There's a lot of uncertainty and increasing burden there. And I think with natural events, the industry is still learning about what happened with the Tonga volcano and its impact on submarine cables in that part of the Pacific. There's a lot that we don't know about the natural environment, even now. And so much of the seabed is, particularly in the deep ocean, is not mapped at all. There are route studies that are done for particular submarine cables, but those are very, very linear for a particular route. And aren't necessarily going to encompass a wide swath of the seafloor. So I know a lot of the popular focus right now is on malicious acts, which are rare but high impact. And there's only so much that industry can do because the cables can't be hidden. They can't be buried to such a great depth that no one can ever reach them. They can't be armored to repel malicious attacks. And so the focus is much more on resilience and encouraging other parties to promote that. Thank you.
Thank you for kicking off the discussion, focusing specifically on physical threats. I know that in our list of discussants, there are some that are focusing potentially more on the cyber side as well. So if we stay on the topic of threats, would anyone perhaps? Pavel here, but I'm also giving Noel and Tobias if you want to jump in as well. We'll go to Noel and then we'll come to you, Pavel. Noel, over to you.
Thanks, Jacob. Yes, so in response to your question, you spoke previously about sea blindness, and I think in many states in the world, sea blindness is pretty pervasive, but so is cyber blindness. And the convergence of these two aspects leads to some particularly complex situations. So if we look at frameworks for responsible state behavior in cyberspace, for example, and then we expose that now to the question of cyber risks to submarine cables, we're presupposing that a state has a certain amount of cyber power, proper cyber strategies in place, incident response mechanisms, but also a certain level of maritime power and the ability to project that maritime power. And in fact, this is not the case. So you're actually sitting, especially in developing states here, with a double-edged sword, a more complex challenge than potentially in developed states. On top of that, you have fewer cables necessarily going into states like this. So there's less redundancy, there's less resilience already. And of course, landlocked states inside of them who are now reliant on their sea-facing partners to actually provide services and manage these forms of risk appropriately. So it actually starts becoming quite a tricky scenario where perhaps there's underinvestment and lack of capability both within the maritime domain and the cyber domain. And then I think also where nation states don't necessarily control or have any say over some of the infrastructure in their states, particularly often end-to-end communications infrastructure, which has recently been laid out, but by potentially, for example, a foreign partner. So you have this phenomena of client states as well. And in terms of cyber risk, who owns the routers? Who owns the base stations? How do we manage these kinds of problems? And of course, one of the big things I think that does worry one quite a lot is, issues, for example, of bulk signals tapping at base stations and that type of thing. So from a cybersecurity point of view, I think it's taking the already existing cybersecurity challenges in developing states, and it's just making them, when you add the maritime challenges on top of that much more complex. Thanks.
Thank you, Noel. I'll go here on the stage to Pavel and then back to Tobias online.
Thank you so much, Giacomo. And also, let me thank UNIDIR, first of all, for convening this discussion, for inviting Microsoft to participate and share industry views. And before diving into it, I would also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Kavanaugh for her super insightful paper. I don't remember the last time I've read a 40-page report in 60 minutes. It was, I read it without the break. It was really great. I recommend it to the audience and also to the EU for sponsoring this study. As far as Microsoft is concerned, we truly want to emphasize that submarine cables are fundamental to the internet. The scale of their contribution is difficult to overstate. You have put in the paper that it is around 95% of all intercontinental internet traffic, making them fundamental to what the Global Commission on Stability of Cyberspace calls the public core of the internet, which includes the software, the computers, and other physical equipment that make the internet work for all of us globally. What are some of the threats? I think Kent has already covered the physical threats really well, and we have already heard about cyber threats. So let me go into the cyber threat landscape a little bit more in detail. And this, of course, includes what we would discuss as the man-made intentional damage. So the type of risks, cyber attacks can be directed at the network management system used to handle data traffic passing through the cables. And while severing submarine cable, as Kent has already mentioned, can actually cause a huge amount of public disruption, it can cut off critical state government and public communications, and it can create economic damage and societal chaos. The cyber attack could create similar levels of disruption without physical damage to the cables, and of course also with all the attribution challenges that it entails as opposed to a physical attack. There is also a growing risk of potential tapping and or stealing or even altering of data passing through the cables. This is arguably more difficult to accomplish at this stage. But at this stage being the operative word here, and there are already some state actors who have developed sophisticated offensive cyber capability. Also, we have to look at the larger threat landscape here when we discuss cyber risks, because these are far from theoretical today. We analyze around-the-clock cyber threats from our signal intelligence across our products and services, and the overall picture is not encouraging. State and state-affiliated actors are growing more brazen and aggressive in cyberspace, and we have consistently highlighted in our public reports that this trend is really deteriorating. Over the last year alone, we have seen nation-state groups increasingly targeting critical infrastructure and employing indiscriminate cyber attacks against ICT supply chains. I'm sure we'll get to the ICT supply chain problem in a moment. And we have seen these attacks across the globe. All this is in seeming disregard of international expectations and framework of responsible state behavior in cyberspace that was endorsed by all states and also referenced by Manon in her original intervention when she mentioned the 11 norms of responsible state behavior, and I'm sure we'll also get to the normative approaches later on. And we see this manifest. We see this manifest across the world. No nation, large or small, has been spared. And in this environment, intentional attacks on infrastructure that is critical to the functioning of the global internet, including the cables, is becoming quite likely. Last year, we have seen a cyber attack on KSAT Viasat network, and it knocked out thousands of people offline across multiple EU member states. That attack was attributed to a state actor, I might add. And there are publicly available reports that nation-state cyber attacks were already directed at subsea cable networks with limited effect, fortunately. So we believe that all relevant stakeholders must come together to maximize the protection of this critical infrastructure. And we all have a role to play here. Private sector operators need to prioritize investments to help secure both the submarine cables and the data that flow through them. Governments should recognize that these cables are increasingly vulnerable to disruption and destruction, and the consequences for citizens would be severe, prolonged, and indiscriminate, and take appropriate policy responses, including at the global level. And of course, civil society and academia have an important role to play here, both in communicating about the threats posed by disruption of this infrastructure, as UNIDIR is doing today, and by helping define the acceptable norms and boundaries for protection in this space. I'll leave it at this. I'm happy to go into more detail about what Microsoft does specifically in terms of cybersecurity best practices and also on the supply chain threats later on. Thank you.
Thanks, Pavel. Tobias, over to you.
Thank you, Giacomo. I'll just add that speaking about the threats and vulnerabilities, I think it's also important to see it in the broader perspective that we also face a new international political reality, which leads to increasing recognition of the strategic importance of subsea infrastructure in general, being it data cables and energy pipes and so on. And this stems from intensified great power rivalry, war in Europe, increased pressure on the liberal world order, climate change, global economic shifts, weaponization of trade and supply chains, also things that have been brought up. But just to say that there's also this broader picture to talking threats and vulnerabilities, especially the ones that are imposed intentionally by humans. Then zooming in on the on the threats, vulnerabilities, the cyber threat is obviously one, and it contains multiple, I think, dimensions, being it software and network management, as was mentioned by Pavel, but also data theft and digital sovereignty and quite a number of different threats. And I think that speaks to one of the key issues when we talk threats, vulnerabilities, but also then management, mitigation, governance, that we see so many different problematizations in a way of what kind of problems the cable system poses. Is this a cybersecurity problem? Is this a maritime security problem? Is this a problem of military involvement and warfare? Is it mainly a problem of natural accidents? Again, a problem of perhaps data sovereignty. And all of these different ways of framing and posing the problem renders the infrastructure into quite a different task from a governance and mitigation perspective. It lends itself to various different institutions, governance-wise, various practices, various forms of expertise, caretaking, and I think that is one of the reasons why it's hard to come up with common approaches, and why we see sort of a divergence across these problematization, and none of them kind of sit on top of the other. That it's still in development in a way. So we see across countries, across institutions, that it differs which of these problematizations or threat narratives, pictures that sort of become the dominant one, and how you, according to that, tailor your way of governing and your way of mitigating.
Thank you, Tobias, also for raising an interesting point about bridging us to perhaps the second question that we're going to cover in a second about mitigating and managing the risk. And to me, when I hear in every scenario, what I hear that it is difficult to identify the problem or who is actually responsible for the problem, that's kind of the best scenario under which then nobody solves it. Because if it's a problem of, if everyone is affected in an equal way and there is no clarity on where responsibility lies for what, that is kind of the perfect setting for then everyone thinking that somebody else is taking care of it, and the problem remains unsolved. So thank you also for bringing the issue cybersecurity, maritime security. I think this is an important point to reflect. I see Amrish, you have your hand up, and then also Tuela. Please, Amrish, you have the floor.
Thank you, Giacomo. Thank you for the invitation and the very interesting talks from the different panelists. So coming from the Internet Society, I would like to give the Internet angle and how some countries, especially developing countries in Africa, for example, are very reliant on submarine cables, because most of the data that is being consumed is coming from Europe or the US. So we at the Internet Society, we strive very hard to try to bring the content as close as possible to the end users, but still for example, to fill these content caches, you still need bandwidth and international connectivity. So for these countries which are far away, those submarine cables are extremely important. But one thing we are constantly concerned about is not threats coming from the external. We talked about phishing threats or shipping threats, but threats coming from the internal as well. So we have seen and observed, for example, in some countries like state actors sabotaging their own equipment to operate, for example, internet shutdowns. And we know the consequences of internet shutdowns, and it has a lot of economic implication and impact on the digital economy. So take countries, for example, Nigeria or Kenya, where there is a heavy reliance on mobile money. Banking system might be using internet connectivity for their transactions and everything. So cutting down the internet is quite an important impact that needs to be factored in when thinking about all the threats that are connected to submarine cables. So strengthening the government actors to consider the cables as a more of a common good rather than a threat to their governance is something that is extremely important. And maybe something to add is we need to, there is that separation between terrestrial cables and submarine cables. We don't tend to talk about them together, but I think one technology or one type of connectivity complements the other. And for example, if there's a cable break, it should be possible for other countries to still communicate via other means, so via terrestrial connectivity. So it is important actually when thinking about connectivity in general, not to think only about submarine cable, because there's a lot of focus on submarine cables, because we see also a lot of investments, whether it is from the telcos or from the hyperscalers, but less on the terrestrial side of things. Thank you.
Thank you, Amrish. Tuela, over to you.
Thank you very much, Giacomo, and good morning, good afternoon to everyone. I just want to also echo my appreciation to Camino for the report, which I think was very well written and I think was very good at extracting the different issues, but also highlighting specific recommendations in terms of the different actors involved. And then also just to appreciate UNIDIR's invitation for this very important dialogue. So I work for the African Union Development Agency, which is an intergovernmental development agency of the African Union. I'm not speaking on behalf of governments, but I will perhaps just offer a few perspectives in terms of some of the things that our governments have to grapple with, and perhaps how that also could contribute to the discussion, but also maybe the learnings that we could take from this discussion. I think when we look at the first thing perhaps is the geography and the geography of Africa and the geography of the cable systems themselves. I think Africa finds itself positioned in a way that strategically I think is relevant in terms of connecting, whether it's to Europe, to America, to Asia. But we also see then that the geography of the cable systems follows certain patterns which perhaps affect the way in which member states perceive the significance and importance of those communications. You will notice that perhaps in the ICPC, the membership is largely from the African region. I think about plus minus 16 countries that are coastal countries. So you don't see any of the countries that are landlocked or land-linked participating in that, which signals a little bit of a concern in the sense that maybe we need to have a little bit more awareness and understanding of what these cable systems mean, even for the landlocked countries. The fact that countries are landlocked, they still depend and rely on the submarine cable system, and it's important then that they are adequately informed and adequately participating in some of these issues around the protection of the cable systems. I think that perhaps there is an assumption that this is an issue or a problem only for the coastal countries that have landing stations or that have massive installations of submarine cable systems. But maybe we need to change that perception, and maybe we need a little bit more advocacy and awareness so that we all understand what's at stake in terms of the disruptions as far as submarine cable systems are concerned. More recently, I think we've seen some kind of a move to having what are being called virtual landing stations or landing points that are now inland. And this also perhaps begs the question of how we will make sure that we look at the system a bit more holistically. So the cable systems, submarine systems themselves are only serving to provide connectivity to various other, subsystems. And I think this has been adequately mentioned in the report. And the question is, how do we make those connections? How do we make sure that protecting the submarine cable systems is seen as an integral and inherent part of the overall protection of the entire internet ecosystem and infrastructure? I think on the African side, currently there are a lot of policy frameworks that are being developed, cybersecurity, around data governance, and so on, and even going so far as also addressing this, issues of what constitutes critical infrastructure. The challenge will be what next? We will have the policy frameworks, but what will that then mean in terms of actual implementation? and actual enforcement of some of the things that perhaps the policy frameworks may be calling for. And this perhaps will also be an issue of capacity and resources, because we perhaps may not have the requisite capacity in terms of the technical capacity to deal with some of these issues, but also the financial resources insofar as being able to adhere to some of the provisions that will be required by the various policy frameworks. Lastly, I think that trade, whether it's intra-regional trade or trade, between Africa and other regions, is a key driver of connectivity. And I think that if we position the discussion and the arguments that way, I think for a lot of our member states, it will begin to make sense, and they will then begin to have to see how not dealing adequately with issues of cybersecurity and the resilience of the various cable systems, be it subsea systems or terrestrial systems, has a very big impact in terms of the economic development of the region and linking it to issues of intra and interregional trade. Thank you.
Thank you, Tuela, and I'm looking forward to hearing more about the policy frameworks you've mentioned in the next session about governance and policy responses. Sandra, over to you.
I'd just also like to echo and thank Camino for her paper, and as an owner and operator of subsea cables, I could probably list all of what she listed as the threat and vulnerabilities. But I suppose from an operational perspective on a day-to-day, the thing that we're still focused on is obviously the permitting regime, which continues to become more and more complicated as the cable routes catch up with cable development, whereby we're seeing a lot of different landings, where the length of cables, the routing, etc. That continues to be a real challenge. And then obviously, is the cable operational? Has there been an issue? If there has been an issue, what is it? Is it on the wet segment? Is it on the terrestrial segment? Is it fishing? Is it a natural event? And then more concerning, is it a cyber or international sabotage? All of those things link into what is probably continues to be one of the greatest challenges for the industry, which is the supply chain issues. And I know I'm kind of jumping to the end, but I think they are all linked in relation to that. I mean, the number of players in this industry continues to be of concern. We've got a lot of challenges in regards to how we actually make this a business for those providers who can be on quite low margins when they look at the rate of return in either investment in factories, so you can actually get cable supplied, the ships, their challenges with permitting, because if there's a permitting delay and they're on a project, and how they manage their actual fleet. So all of these things are actually interconnected, and having the overall guiding framework and a common approach is something that we as a owner and operator would definitely very much welcome in relation to that. I should also say that cybersecurity also remains a challenge, a bit like for Microsoft, but there's a lot of development and focus on that area. And on the governmental side, we see a lot of requests for information coming from various governments. And I think particularly with what happened to Nord Stream, there was kind of a lot of activity in trying to get an understanding of what these assets are, which again, we welcome. But we're probably at the stage now where we need that to be a bit more of a two-way engagement rather than just from a data collection perspective. So all of those things are going to, I suppose, improve the whole focus and regime for subsea cables as we go into the future.
Thank you, Sandra. I'm just going to abuse my powers of moderator. We're going to steal some time from the break. Don't worry, we're still going to have a break. But I would like to give the opportunity to our speakers to engage also on particularly the second and the last question, if I had to prioritize. When it comes, we've heard all about the threats. It'd be good to get your perspective in a minute to 90 seconds each on what can be done to manage or mitigate these threats, to build or increase the resilience of the infrastructure as such. And it was interesting because we heard physical threats, we heard about cyber threats, but we also heard about a threat I didn't think about, which I will, incorrectly label like soft threats, which are the delays in getting permits to intervene, or all of the kind of the bureaucracy in itself, the bureaucratic mechanism that is behind the operation of this critical infrastructure, is also in itself a threat if it gets in the way of timely and effective intervention by those that are meant to ensure continuity of service. So we've heard all about threats. I would like to give the floor to React for a minute or so on risk mitigation and management, including of supply chain risks. Who would like to go first? Pavel, please.
So I'm happy to keep the ball rolling on the cyber part, and then the physical and soft, I'll leave that to the other panelists. So I would say that leaving the physical layer aside for now and recognizing that on a practical level, it is consortia of private companies, including Microsoft, who own and operate these cables that we have a great deal of responsibility for their security. So recognizing that. And to Amresh's point, I would very much hope that governments would remember this fact before considering sabotaging their own equipment, which may not necessarily be their own equipment in practical reality. But going to the data layer that covers the actual traffic flow and content, Microsoft in this regard practices and recommends to everybody a zero trust approach for cybersecurity threats here, which pretty much assumes cybersecurity breaches. Some of these concrete implementation measures have included, and they have been applied to subsea cables, reinforced user identity credentials as a mitigation measure, device health verification, validation of app health, least privilege access to both resources and services. And encryption is also a critical element of the overall cybersecurity and data protection strategy when it comes down to the subsea cables. In the unlikely event that a malicious actor gains access to the data traffic passing through the submarine cable, encryption is key that can make it prohibitively difficult to extract data that reinforces the confidentiality. This is one of the big differences between the telegraph cables that I believe were actually tapped quite frequently for that particular reason, because there was no encryption. So it's important that governments keep continuing protecting encryption and let us do our work to secure the safety of the digital ecosystem. On the control layer, I think that's what governs how the data is routed around the global public internet. Here, active and passive external network scanning for policy validation offers a further layer of protection that can help to keep the entire infrastructure secure. And then what about the supply chain risks? Indeed, I would say that we have seen a rise in sophisticated supply chain cyber attacks targeting the IT sector as a gateway to downstream customers, including critical infrastructure customers, including subsea cable operators. These tactical adjustments have resulted in new approaches and large-scale attacks against corporate supply chains. The IT services supply chains have become a very common target as an actor, and we expect that malicious actors will continue to exploit trusted relationship in enterprise supply chains, including by attacking and implanting malicious code into software update mechanisms that are then distributed widely into the digital ecosystem, including to critical infrastructure operators. And then that implanted malicious code can be later leveraged by a state actor in the times of crisis. And mind you, this is mostly a nation state sophisticated capability. This is not something that you can defend against with basic cybersecurity practices. So I would say on the mitigation measures that we should all pay greater attention to our supply chains and make sure that we apply the zero trust principle there. But beyond that, states can take practical measures on the international level, including at the UN. I'm happy to get to that later, to protect supply chains from nation state attacks. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you, Pavel. Kent, you want to start the physical one, please?
Yes, thank you. And I will touch briefly on cyber as well. So I'll take the question in two parts. First, for managing risk and then improving resilience. With managing risk, I think I have four thoughts that come to mind. First, using technology. For physical threats, there are emerging technologies like fiber sensing that use the cable itself as a hydrophone that can be used to detect threats to the cable. There are also options for things like underwater drones for patrolling the route of the cable. For cybersecurity, as Microsoft has noted, encryption. That's not always used at the infrastructure level, but it should be at every level with customers, the system owner, customers. Encryption can be very effective in protecting traffic. Second area, policies and procedures, implementing that zero trust approach with physical and logical access policies, supply chain assurance and scrutiny by customers, not just assumptions that suppliers will take care of it themselves. Personnel screening, hardening of shore-end facilities as well, which can be particularly vulnerable. Third area, intelligence sharing, data sharing between governments and industry, particularly in trying to detect patterns of activity that could reveal something nefarious or malicious. Some governments are very, very reluctant to do that, and it's very, very concerning that they don't want to share information with industry and have a two-way conversation with industry. And then finally, having a holistic risk-based approach to vulnerabilities and threats with an allocation of resources accordingly, because ultimately cable damage or a disruption of communications, whether it is malicious or it results from something more benign, has the same economic and national security impact with network downtime. With resilience, I think the key thing is to promote geographic diversity of routes and landings. We have too much clustering going on, and there is a need for governments to think about how their environmental policies, particularly under the new BBNJ treaty, where we may have marine protected areas on the high seas, with some indicating that cable routing or transits through those MPAs should be prohibited, to think about the impact on resilience and the ability to connect particularly small island states. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I think it is time now for us to take a short break. We will resume in 10 minutes at 40 minutes past the hour. Before we break, I just wanted to remind colleagues online that if you have any questions you'd like to ask to our panelists, please use the Q&A interface on WebEx, and here in the room as well. If you do have questions at any time, please do raise your hand and make sure that I see you, so so that we can direct the questions to our speakers. So thank you so much. We're going to stay. Please stay connected. Don't leave the meeting. We're going to be back in 10 minutes. There is coffee outside for those that are here in the room with us. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, welcome back after the break. We are now going to proceed with the second session and dedicate the next 45-50 minutes to the discussion of governance and policy responses. The next session will be moderated by Camino, and the format will be exactly as the previous one. To all of our great speakers, both here on the stage and online, feel free to intervene. I will be monitoring who is raising the hand and will let Camino know. So Camino, please, over to you. Oh, yes, one thing, can you please put up the guiding questions for the second session? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Giacomo. So here we are moving on to the second session where we're very interested in learning more about the subsea cable governance and policy responses. So we've developed a few guiding questions here. I'm just going to go quickly through them quickly. How was the governance of subsea cable? How has the governance of subsea cable data cables evolved over time? Do existing UNCLOS provisions provide sufficient coverage for the kinds of threats affecting subsea cable systems today? What other measures and best practices can help strengthen the security and resilience of cables across regions? We mentioned some of those today. And what would a strengthened subsea cable governance regime look like? I think, if you don't mind, Kent, I'm going to start with you with the first question. And please, other participants online and here as well, Pavel, please flag when you want to come in with your own thoughts on this question or any of the other ones. But please, Kent, let's start with you.
Great, thank you, Camino. So in terms of governance of submarine cable systems, there is no, as I noted before, there's no intergovernmental organization that oversees submarine cables. And so unlike other activities in the marine environment, like shipping with the International Maritime Organization, deep seabed mining with the International Seabed Authority, and fishing with the regional fisheries management organizations organized under the UN Food and Agriculture Organization. We don't have that for submarine cables. That's not a role that the ITU plays, the International Telecommunication Union. And so people often think that the ICPC is an IGO and it's an NGO. And so there is no international organization that is really overseeing this sector. The sector relies on freedoms and responsibilities established for states in the Law of the Sea Convention. And that is also an issue because as a treaty, the Law of the Sea Convention is establishing those rights and responsibilities for states, but it's private actors who were engaged in this sector in building, operating, and repairing submarine cables. They're subject to government permissions. Governments license submarine cable operators, the owners of the systems, for their activities in areas of jurisdiction. But there is not a licensing regime for submarine cables on the seabed of the high seas or the area. The International Seabed Authority, under the terms of the Law of the Sea Convention, its jurisdiction is limited to minerals-related activities as defined in that convention. And so the Law of the Sea Convention really provides the regulatory certainty and framework for these private actors, relying ultimately on the rights of states to act. But there's even discussion about which states. This is something we're looking at in the International Law Association's Committee on Submarine Cables and Pipelines, about which states are asserting jurisdiction or asserting rights on behalf of cable operators. Is it the flag state for a cable ship? Is it the state in which a cable owner is incorporated? Is it a state in which a submarine cable lands? It could be all of those things. But we have very underdeveloped law in this area as well because it's private actors without a lot of state espousal of claims. And so we don't have a lot of dispute settlement decisions interpreting either the jurisdictional provisions or the cable protection provisions of the Law of the Sea Convention.
Thank you very much, Kent. That was very, very interesting. Could you before we move on, could you give us an idea, just a quick overview of the work of the International Law Association on subsea cables and pipelines?
Sure. So this committee was established by one of the prior ILA presidents in an area where there had not been activity before. But we are now working on our third report looking at gaps in the international legal regime for submarine cables and really focusing with the third report on state practice. In the second report, we were looking at things like state treatment of route surveys and post-installation burial surveys as marine scientific research, as we have a lot of uncertainty even there about which category do particular activities fall into that relate to the submarine cable industry. And again, we don't have a lot of tribunal decisions interpreting those. And so the ILA in some ways has stepped into the breach.
Thank you very much for that, Kent. Do any of our other speakers online want to come in at the stage?
Tuela.
Tuela, over to you.
Thank you very much. Maybe just a quick note, I think, in terms of the whole issue of governance, and not specific to subsea cables necessarily, but looking at just where Africa is in terms of its various policy and regulatory frameworks. So most recently, in terms of the digital transformation strategy for Africa, the African Union has embarked on a process of sort of developing a harmonized approach to policy and regulation in line with the digital single market. And this has three main areas that are being considered. So the first one is looking at connectivity, the second one is looking at data, and the third one is looking at services. Now, what I want to perhaps bring to this discussion is the fact that in the contextualization of connectivity, there is broad mention of what is referred to as international bandwidth or international connectivity, but this is not fully articulated in terms of trying to break it down in terms of what exactly is this international connectivity. There is, of course, an underlying assumption that part of it is indeed the connectivity that comes through the submarine and subsea data cables, but again, not explicitly mentioned. And I think that the risk there is that not being explicitly mentioned means that it's likely to fall through the cracks and not be properly addressed in terms of really what should the policy and regulatory mechanisms look like for Africa when dealing with submarine cables. I think that there's also perhaps the risk that a lot of times this is considered to be a private sector issue and not something for governments to consider and address. And there is a need perhaps to address some of these misconceptions or misperceptions. Back to you.
Thank you, Tuela. And just a follow-on question is, how and in which form would those questions need to be addressed? Thank you.
So I think because the whole idea is that this is meant to be a framework that should sort of harmonize and standardize across the continent. So it would basically inform the way in which member states would address some of their policy and regulatory issues insofar as digital single market is concerned. And the idea then is that this framework sets the container for transposition into national policies, regulations, laws, etc. And I think the risk, like I said, is that if we're not specifically mentioning subsea cables, for instance, then it becomes very difficult for that issue to be adequately addressed. Now, if you say where should these things and where should this be brought to, or to whose attention, definitely it's at the level of the African Union. And I think it is, of course, I think one of our responsibilities. So we have noted that and we will definitely flag it as something that needs to be looked at a bit more specifically, because I think it does run the risk of falling through the cracks.
Thank you very much, Tuela. Any of our other participants? Amrish, please, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I would like to quickly intervene on how complex the governance of subsea cables has actually evolved. So originally, we know that it's telco operators that are part of the consortia, They are usually licensed operators, and this is already very well regulated by the local regulators. But now we see other types of actors coming into the picture where probably they do not have a license to operate, or the regime is completely different. So it is these different types of actors coming into the picture is adding into making this whole governance of the subsea cable quite complex. And this is where international laws and international collaboration is very welcome actually in this space.
Thank you, Amrish. And over to you, Pavel.
Thank you so much, Camino. And thank you so much also, Kent, for the overview. I think what I am taking away from this is that submarine cables today enjoy certain, albeit limited, protection under existing international law. I mean, we have heard, for example, some calls for, and I think that was Manon at the beginning, that states should indeed ratify the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea to increase clarity in this space. But we have to remember that even if that happens, if we achieve 193 ratifications of that convention, the legal regimes that we're discussing here and that were so brilliantly outlined in your paper, Camino, were written at a time when the globally interdependent and interconnected and mostly privately owned architecture of the global internet was not a reality. It didn't exist. It was written for a different time. So there's so many questions that need to be clarified at this point. The question is, what if some states do not ratify the UNCLOS Convention? How do we ensure that they comply with the existing framework? Another question would be, how do existing legal frameworks apply to modern technology? And of course, as you mentioned, Kent, how is jurisdiction asserted and by whom and in what instance? So all these questions, there are so many uncertainties that create concerns that certain states may seek to exploit the gray areas that exist in this space. I think the second point I wanted to make is that some states today even claim that existing international law as a whole does not apply to the ICT environment as such. So that's another concerning thing, because we might have some states that say, whatever, whether we ratified UNCLOS or not, whether we ratify the Geneva Conventions that mandate that states should be using their targeting according to principles of distinction, proportionality, legality, and necessity and distinction, we might have that happening. So I do believe that we need to strengthen the normative regime, and we at Microsoft have been arguing for that, bearing a legal fix, which may be difficult in the current environment, and Camino, you have mentioned that at the beginning. We would strongly encourage states to extend the existing commitments that they have already made, including the normative commitments at the UN, and here we come to the forum where this could be discussed. We think the open-ended working group on cybersecurity in New York could be a good venue to discuss at least the cyber aspect, the cyber threats of the submarine cables. And the existing norms could be extended in one way or the other to the submarine cables. We already have a norm on protection of critical infrastructure. We have a norm that prohibits states from attacking critical infrastructure of other states in violation of international law. We also have a norm on supply chain security that tells states that encourages states to take measures to undermine, to take measures to protect supply chain security. So all these could be extended. We think that also additional guidance on the existing normative framework could be issued, such as that states should not engage in activities that disrupt the submarine cables or their related infrastructure that form public core of the internet. This could include actions causing physical damage, destruction of submarine cables, but also the supporting infrastructure, as we have discussed, such as cable laying ships and cable landing facilities. States should also explicitly acknowledge that during international conflict, international humanitarian law prohibits attacking, destroying, removing, or rendering submarine cables useless. This is because the loss of internet access for disruption of power, health, safety, or other critical infrastructure could lead to severe, prolonged, indiscriminate humanitarian consequences to citizens. The distinguishing between military target or a civilian target when attacking a submarine cable would be extremely difficult. I will leave it at that for now, but we believe there are ways that this normative regime could be strengthened even without legally binding obligations.
Thank you very much, Pavel. And I think you'll see in the 2021 GG report the additional layer of understanding that was provided there, and that draws on different submissions by states, also already goes in that direction. While it doesn't necessarily discuss subsea cables per se, I think the language that's used does very much point in that direction. I think it would be interesting also to see a cross-fertilization of the discussions that are happening at the ILA with some of these other normative discussions already underway at the open-ended working group and so forth. And also, I think I mentioned in the report, there are several recommendations that have been made and suggestions that have been made within the context of different initiatives, including the Tallinn Manual. There are other academics that have been working on this for many, many years. I think we have online one of the preeminent subsea cable legal scholars, Tara Davenport, who's also working on a couple of papers and is involved in the ILA as far as I understand. And Tara, please feel free to come in at any stage. So I'm going to hand over to Tobias, who's waiting to pitch in as well.
Thank you, Camino. Yeah, I mean, I don't have a legal background, so I'll stick more to the sort of political side of the governance question, and also tie a little bit back to what we talked about before, which to me showed that there is quite a big divergence in threat perception and in prioritization of governance measures, being it legal measures or other measures, across regions, across countries, across public-private actors, across public authorities within countries, across private actors within consortia, within cable owners, cable layers, telecom providers. So we see this divergence in interests and in prioritization, and that makes governance question very, very hard. And I think that one thing that we need to sort of puzzle out is whether we can have this one size fits all when we think governance, not just in the UNCLOS legal terms, but also at national and regional level. And I've been working mainly on Europe and the EU, where we have seen a great divergence across member states in how they set up their national governance systems, whether this is an area that's dominated by navies and militaries when it comes to governance, or whether it's fishery authorities, or whether it's cybersecurity authorities. There's a great divergence, and we might continue working on these global, international legal schemes, and that of course does something, but I think we also need to look into the national approaches and also the regional approaches, and establish greater knowledge in how different regions approaches the question to see if we can actually do something when it comes to information sharing, reporting schemes, kind of collaboration that perhaps lies outside of what UNCLOS can provide us with right now and in the at least short-term future, because as Pavel said, I mean, a legal fix in the current geopolitical environment is probably hard to imagine, I would say.
Thank you, Tobias. And I'm just wondering if it's difficult to go in the direction of a new or an expanded legal instrument or a new one. I guess I guess what you're pushing towards is confidence building and trust building across within countries and across countries and regions. And I guess there is no harm in using the existing legal basis to discuss progress in adhering to existing commitments, but also highlighting challenges and where there may be lacunae. And I see Kent looking at me as if he wants to come in, and so I'm going to give it over to Kent again.
Thank you, Camino. Yes, I think when we talk about, for example, the Law of the Sea Convention, I think that the jurisdictional provisions in the convention as they relate to submarine cables have been more successful than the cable protection ones. Although even the jurisdictional ones are under threat by what we call jurisdictional creep. Coastal states want to control more and more offshore with submarine cables than the convention actually entitles them to do. But with the cable protection provisions and other obligations, the treaty references the concepts of due regard and reasonable regard, which are generally underdeveloped in terms of interpretation by tribunals. The big decision that we have is in the Chagos Marine Protected Area case, United Kingdom versus Mauritius, which helped to define that concept a bit more. But it hasn't been applied specifically to submarine cables. And what does it mean for showing due regard or reasonable regard for that? It's something we're discussing in the International Seabed Authority right now, because it implicates both Articles 87 and 147 of the convention. And so I think in terms of the Law of the Sea Convention itself, its efficacy in mitigating risks from fishing and anchors, which are the big causes of cable damage, or even more malicious ones, it has not been particularly effective. And what we really need is more activity at the state level. Article 113 of the convention calls for the establishment of a punishable offense for cable damage done willfully or through culpable negligence, but I think that is woefully inadequate. And a lot of states haven't even implemented that where they have ratified the convention. So we have a need not just to ratify, but also implement obligations under the treaty, but also to do other things, to establish a more effective liability regime for claims for damage, to incentivize others in the marine environment to protect cables or avoid damaging them because of the costs that would be incurred. So I think there's more that can be done there. There's more with flag states to the extent that commercial fishing vessels and ships used for transport of bulk goods and cargo are damaging cables, to have more oversight. We've recently seen a couple of cases of cable damage by the so-called ghost fleet, which is operating in spite of various economic sanctions regimes to transport petroleum and natural gas in contravention of those sanctions. Those ships are not responsive to parties who reach out to them saying, we think you just damaged our cable. There's no insurance or insurer to engage with to seek compensation there. And the questions we get back from governments are often, are you sure that wasn't malicious given the parties that might be involved there? We don't know. But this is a continuing issue, I know, within the legal committee of the IMO, but it's not one that they have a sufficient handle on yet. So those are just a few thoughts of additional activity we need both at the multilateral level and at the national level.
Thank you so much, Kent. We have a question from the floor. Simone.
Yeah, thank you very much. Samuele Dominioni from UNIDIR. I have actually two questions. The first one by referring to the map that we saw earlier today. It seems that there are like sort of highways of cables. And so also in the considering the idea of like diversifying this as a geographical distribution of cables, I want to understand better who are the actors involved in the decision of where to locate the cables, and at the same time, if there are any incentives of benefits for states to host the cables, like the end point of a submarine cables. And of course, I think, as we discussed a bit with Mr. Bressi, about also the burden that hosting a cable on your own soil implies. Thank you.
Okay, we have another question and then another intervention from Noel, and then we'll go back to the speakers. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Sorry, you can hear me. Sorry, David from the Canadian Mission. First Secretary. So I have a first question. Is it 110 or 220? Because I'm in Canada and I need to be sure when I plug in that cable. I don't need to step down or step up. Jokes aside, an important point I think was raised by Microsoft on the needs to deepen legal understandings, because I think this is a similar problem that we're seeing elsewhere in cyberspace. There's a jump to conclusions that new laws, new treaties, new norms are needed when in fact we haven't actually discussed existing law. Understanding that a lot of these laws or norms were from an analog world, but I think the applicability largely holds up, and I think that's a position that Canada continues to hold. I had one other comment, obviously, on distinction, which is always a problem, I think, in terms of IHL. Dual usage technology or critical infrastructure that is supporting a military and civilian is highly problematic. I suspect that's also the same logic model that would be applied to subsea cabling. But my question is simply to do with like the sovereignty of the data that's flowing through the cables as it lands. And how do companies manage this or states manage this question? Because we're hearing a lot of growing interest around data governance, data free flow with trust. It's on the international agenda. And I'm just curious, how do you manage the throughput traffic from a data, I think it was mentioned by Kent, data sovereignty perspective? So I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Noel?
Thank you. Yes, just backing onto that last question about data sovereignty, what we see a lot from Africa is that data that leaves here seldom takes the shortest route over the most direct cable, but will often be routed through 2 or 3 continents and take a very long route around. So that's quite a complicated question. But also coming onto the back of that in terms of dual use technologies, one problem in the norms debate and the whole regulatory framework is a growing proliferation of non-state actors, both in cyberspace, but also in terms of organized criminal syndicates who are targeting increasingly in developing countries infrastructure theft, infrastructure damage. And of course, norms don't cover these types of actors. And we find that they are growing in size, scale, and ability, both in cyberspace, but on land as well. And by definition at sea, I mean, there are non-state actors at sea along various coastlines which have very singular points of cable landings as well. So, I think that's the outline in terms of the norms, is how do we start dealing with these people, and also when they're harnessed as proxies. It's a difficult one.
Thank you very much, Noel. So I'm wondering, before we'll come back to you in a second, if any of you want to take up any of the questions. Sandra, would you like to come in on any of these governance policy related questions?
Yes, so maybe the question around the routing, and I know my colleague from NEC will probably give a bit more of a technical knowledge on that, but that is driven obviously by a number of factors, and there are differing in what I would call the commercial cables that are being built by private operators, and then what's been built and funded on specific routes to try and ensure connection. So there is a slight differing approach in relation to that when the question is, well, where do you buy a cable, or sorry, where do you build a cable to and from, because there are 2 differing views. But a lot of it, as we've seen, particularly with a number of the comments raised already, is with the hyperscalers who are now very, very heavily investing in these routes in regions that make sense for their business model. They're planning, they're forecasting ahead, they're looking at use, they're looking at potential use, they're looking at resilience. So, they're looking 2, 3, 5, even longer years ahead, trying to forecast what the demand would be and where the new routes may be based on their other commercial services that they're offering within those countries. The routing is very much then, I suppose, driven by both the supplier, the permitting, the seabed conditions, it is, and then and I think a number of panelists mentioned this at all, if there's this particular requirement to have a corridor coming in to a particular country, that's where they need you to put your subsea cable. And I think we've heard what the challenges would be in relation to that. So when you do that, you have to build in a number of different factors in relation to that. Just to comment, I suppose, very briefly on the incentives for states. Again, it depends on the two operational models, whether you're building it for connectivity, to connect a particular island or between two routes. And I know the EU is has a lot of focus on that at the particular moment with regard to funding, or whether you're doing it more on the commercial basis because there's a demand there for your other business. But if you're looking at it particularly from the commercial basis, well, obviously, if there's a demand for this cable, it does have a natural then benefit to the overall state from that perspective. Some of the states do make quite a lot of money out of this. Well, I shouldn't say quite a lot, but there is, there can be permitting fees, there can be regulatory fees, there can be ongoing fees. We've got issues of cabotage in some areas, some jurisdictions. So, that overall view from a state as to whether they're seeing this as a money-making opportunity or to enhance the other economic environment can be quite different from state to state. The burden, speaking, I suppose, where I am from the moment, from Ireland, this is probably a burden that I would suspect our government spends quite a lot of time, because we have a huge amount of media speculation on an ongoing basis of ships appearing and potential acts of sabotage and whatever. It is a difficult one to navigate, I think, particularly when you don't have a land border for those states and who may not have a very strong military presence. So I think, again, it depends from state to state what their view would be of whether this is a burden as well.
Thank you so much, Sandra. We had one response to Canada, except just before you depart. Sorry about that.
Apologies, David. So yes, a quick response to Canada. I have taken note of what you said, David, about the whole nexus of new norms, whether we need to implement and adhere to existing law or whether we need new regulations. I think the point for Microsoft would be that we very much approach this from what is actually happening in the threat landscapes and seeing what the threats are, projecting what the future threats will be, and trying to come up and trying to encourage governments and other stakeholders to make concrete commitments to protect the digital world that works for all of us. And in that sense, to us, whether it's a new legally binding obligation or whether it's a normative commitment that exists under the existing framework, that's something for states to decide. That's a question of process at the UN. But what we can do is we can tell you, looking at the existing framework today, there are some challenges, there are some gaps, there are things that are not currently answered in the legal framework. The way we fix it is, of course, it's a question for states to decide that. I would say if a global agreement is difficult to achieve, and here I agree with you, we need to have a discussion on the applicability of international law at the intersection of both cybersecurity and the law of the sea and state responsibility, and identify and close any potential loopholes. We would also encourage states to issue national statements on how they believe these different bodies of law apply in this environment so that we can undersee whether all states actually consider that subsea cables would be protected from cyber attack or physical attack under most circumstances. We have not yet heard that from all states. I think another thing that we could probably aim toward, and that we would encourage states to aim toward, is at least a political commitment that they would refrain from attacking subsea cables. If a legal commitment is not possible at this stage, for all sorts of reasons, a political commitment could be made. And here, Camino, you mentioned the GGE 21 report, and in particular, the guidance on critical infrastructure. We have read this very carefully, and it defines it as an infrastructure forming the backbone of society. It names specific activities and lists particular examples, including, and I quote, energy, power generation, water, sanitation, education, commercial, financial services, transportation, electoral processes. But subsea cables and other physical infrastructure that is absolutely essential to the functioning of the public core is not in that guidance at this stage. So perhaps that is something that we could also consider as a compromise solution, making that commitment at the global level that states will not attack the essential components of public core of the internet and coming up with a global agreement on what these components actually are. I would very much argue that subsea cables are there. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Pavel. I would slightly correct you on that. If you read down a little bit further in the 2021 guidance, there is a reference to the infrastructure that is essential to the availability and or the integrity of the functioning of the internet. And it's also in the open-ended working group report, which is critical, I think, for what you mentioned of bringing the conversation forward. So I don't know whether you, our colleague from Canada, would like to take the floor again before I hand to Simon.
Absolutely, thank you. No, and sorry, let me just slightly nuance my first comment by saying Canada doesn't oppose the idea that an eventuality of that there may be requirement for legal norms, legal requirements or norms. I think our point at this current state is that we have not really delved deep into current existing international law to see whether the gaps are covered and it's simply interpretation or if something new is required. So slight difference. And I do appreciate the comments by Pavel from Microsoft and all the speakers. I think it's just the issue is we're moving into a 21st century where the digital architecture itself is what is now a social societal underpinning. And I think this is a bit of the concern we have, undersea cables at one point, the ITU exists for a very long 158 years trying to tackle some of these issues, but they've taken on a new meaning, and I think this is in part what the core of the work at the Cyber Open-Ended Working Group and the Program of Action are trying to address. So I certainly appreciate the comments, and I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I think we have Simon, then we have the floor again. So Simon, over to you.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to very quickly pick up on the comments made firstly from the floor, and secondly, the remarks made by Sandra on cable routing. Of course, in territorial waters, states may ultimately decide where the cables land and where they go. This could be based on cable protection corridors or just the physical availability of facilities there. But in the high seas, I think there are two opposing trends that we see at the moment. One is to seek new routes particularly in Asia, I would say, for diversity. And that's very clearly beneficial for cable resilience. The other kind of opposing trend is to reuse routes that have been used by cables which have historically had a low fault rate or a good fault record. So where cables come to the end of their economic or design life, then they tend to be removed, and then the same route can be reused by a new cable because there is a high degree of confidence in the resilience or the reliability of cable built on that route. So that does tend to lead to a kind of clustering of cables in particular corridors. So these are kind of opposing trends, but apply to a certain extent in different areas of the world. So that's my comment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Simon, for clarifying that. And now we have a follow on two fingers from Kent.
Just brief comments in response to the points raised by Simone and by Noel. Regarding benefits of cables, I wanted to highlight that this is not just developed country infrastructure. Submarine cables connect most of the G77. They connect many small island developing states in the Pacific, funded in part by projects led by the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank. And I think that we saw during the pandemic what these cables represent, both in developed and developing countries. They support not just internet access and financial transactions, but teleeducation, telehealth. They carry government communications because governments don't generally own and operate their own cables for communications purposes and the like. They provide competitive advantages in some situations. The European Central Bank issued a very interesting report in connection with Brexit, looking at the financial advantages of London, and one of the principal ones it cited was all of the UK's submarine cable connectivity as compared with other markets elsewhere in Europe. To Noel's comment about non-state actors, very interesting point to make because we've been talking a lot about state actors and the threats that they pose. We have had some discussions within the Maritime Crime Program of the UN Office on Drugs and Crime about these kinds of issues and whether or not there's a need for a further protocol to the SUA Convention for suppression of unlawful acts against the safety of maritime navigation. That could be a mechanism, although we note that states generally have not established offenses for those kinds of activities, and they would need to do so in order to give meaning to that kind of a protocol. But I think that there is some thinking out there about how those kinds of issues could be addressed with non-state actors as well.
Thank you very much, Kent. And we have another colleague from the floor.
Andres Figoli, telecom consultant. It was said that 70% of the cable faults were due to fishing activities. I would like also to stress on the idea that the industry, it is very famous, the ICPC recommendations. I would like to ask Kent, how would you consider them as a legal instrument, even though it is not binding for the state, if it's a good instrument to resolve conflicts between cable owners and projected new infrastructures perhaps even from the state that have ratified the UNCLOS. For example, new pipelines that may enter in collision with existing submarine cables.
This question from the floor.
Yeah, and before Kent, before I give it to you, we have a question from the floor. If you want to read it,
I'm just going to be the voice of the colleague who wrote this question. To all panelists, would you say or confirm that the issue on subsea communication cables and responsible state behavior falls into the realm of cyber diplomacy, considering the underlying domains of international law, vulnerabilities, threats, and policies? That's the question from the floor. Thank you.
So, Andreas, thank you for your question. For those of you not familiar, we had discussed earlier ICPC's best practices for governments, which if you're not familiar with it, haven't looked at it, it's available online on ICPC's website. I'm happy to provide details. That's a 12 to 14 page document really summarizing ICPC's best thinking about how governments can protect cables and increase resilience. The recommendations are a separate set of documents that are more inward-looking to the industry, developing best practices on a whole range of activities, some of them more technical, some of them more regulatory in nature, some focused on coordination with other marine activities, whether it's offshore wind or with pipelines or the like. And I think that that can be a useful means of developing norms and used for engagement with other industries. It's typically the cable industry itself that is developing those. But as we've seen in some cases where different industry groups have been working on similar issues, most famously with the European Submarine Cables Association, was formed by a merger of entities focused on offshore power transmission cables and submarine telecommunications cables following conflicts about development of best practices with offshore wind farms. And they ended up developing a joint recommendation, not ICPC, this is a regional cable protection committee, and there are a number of those around the world. But it did become an effective way of trying to develop joint approaches to mitigating risk and allowing adjacent marine industries to operate together. And so I think that certainly there are opportunities there as well, and some of that more government directed as a vehicle for addressing some of these issues. Again, they're not binding standards, but they are meant to be promoted as best practices.
Thank you very much, Kent. Pavel, do you have any other points there?
So very briefly, I think the answer would be yes, partially. The cyber diplomatic community has a role to play, but this should definitely be a broader effort. I think where cyber diplomacy can be most active is reinforcing the normative commitments. And as you said, already there were UN bodies, resolutions endorsed by consensus that said it is essential to protect the infrastructure that is essential to the general availability and integrity of the internet. Yet At the international level, there has been little to no discussion, at least within the open-ended working group on cybersecurity, what that sentence actually means and what are the individual physical and digital and network components that are essential to internet's functioning. So I think that's a discussion that the OEWG can have. Cyber diplomats can help a lot. Another thing is the question of accountability. When violations do occur, whether we're talking about a legally binding obligation or political obligation, what do we do when violations occur? And of course, having a normative commitment that all states embraced and committed to publicly through the UN, I think it's much easier to demand that accountability when you have that commitment. But of course, this should be a broader conversation. We should actually bring the cyber diplomats together with people like Kent, the lawyers who know about the international law of the high seas and others to have a more detailed conversation on what protection of undersea cables would mean.
Thank you very much, Pavel. Do any of our other colleagues online want to come in on this issue of whether this is an issue for, Tuela, yes, please.
Thank you. I just want to offer maybe one or two comments. So I think, I do agree that the norms, I think, are good. And I think industry norms, I think they help, I think, in terms of setting the stage and contextualizing the issues. But perhaps what one has to then consider is being very specific about the role of governments then, so we industry, I think, understands the issues perhaps better and is clear on what is needed. But maybe what is required also is then to have that same level of understanding on the side of governments. I agree that political statements and commitments could be useful, but at the same time, I think for a lot of our member states, they want to understand what the implications are when they sign onto these conventions and so on. What does that mean on a day-to-day practical level? What does it mean in terms of resourcing, capacity, and so on? So I think there is an important need to take that into account. I also think that because it's such a multifaceted issue and there's so many different institutions, whether at the level of the UN and globally, that are working on this, maybe one also has to do a bit of an analysis in terms of the landscape and trying to understand then clearly where should this issue be situated, whether it is within the UN constellation of institutions or otherwise. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Tuela, and I think that's a really great point to wrap up on. I think fragmentation isn't or diverse different institutions and organizations focusing on the issue isn't necessarily a bad thing. I think also complementarity and more coordination and cooperation across these different parts of the landscape, of the governance landscape, would be very helpful. And I think this first meeting is helping us move in that direction. So I'd like to really thank the panelists, both online and those here today. Thank you, Pavel. Thank you, Kent. And thank you very much, UNIDIR, for facilitating this.
Thank you, Camino. Just one final minute from me. This is being clearly the start of a conversation. We didn't have the ambition to solve the problem in 2.5 hours, but at least we managed to raise awareness in what was quite a significant audience, combining both colleagues here in the room and online. So we see this as the beginning of a journey. Hopefully we'll do more, and organize other opportunities to engage. This was an introduction to the topic. Please do read the report and do share your comments and feedback. Before you leave or disconnect, please do take 30 seconds to fill in our feedback form that you have on the table, or my colleague Wentin posted the link in the chat. It's important that we always capture your feedback so we can improve. And with that, one last round of thank you, both to the audience and to our speakers. And please join me for a round of applause. Thank you.